If we want a beloved community, we must stand for justice, have recognition for difference without attaching difference to privilege. Bell hooks. My name is Toni Griffin. I'm professor of practice here in urban planning at Harvard Graduate School of Design, where you're sitting, and a director of the Just City Lab. Welcome to tonight's keynote address as a part of the Just City Assembly, which is an inaugural convening of about 40 practitioners from around the country coming here to discuss, interrogate, and ideate about the idea that design can actually have an impact on social and spatial justice. In contemporary design, planning, and development practice, we are constantly asked to provide for greater resiliency, sustainability, and equity. However, designers and planners are not always asked to be a part of the problem setting, and rarely does community expertise, alongside technical expertise, receive the same legitimacy as trained expertise and established leadership. The conversations about injustice, if they occur at all, are happening in bifurcated spaces. They require us to confront deep and uncomfortable pains, wrongs, and grievances. The extreme discomfort of even talking about race, inequality, and justice is a barrier to achieving a more just city. The absence of dialogue, interpersonal relationships, spatial proximity even, keeps us from the understanding and the empathy we need to change the unacceptable. The pursuit of justice is inherently a collective act. As such, people who have been invited here today for the Just City Assembly, and we're also joined by our Alumni Council, students, faculty, and members of the Harvard community, believe that they are either champions, believers in the pursuit of justice, and that just outcomes must be arrived at justly. A key objective of our assembly, and we'll be meeting here starting this afternoon and all day tomorrow, will be to determine what practices are replicable or scalable and what remains to be done. To do so, our participants will be asked to reflect upon our current goalpost and where it can be moved to challenge us to identify greater actions and agency for achieving the just city. I'm delighted to keynote this discussion that we're having with a story about Detroit over the last 10 years, its past, its present, and its future. We've invited, or I've invited, I've had an amazing privilege to do so, two colleagues of mine that I've had the privilege to work with in various spaces, but one that started the second iteration of my private practice, Urban AC, Rip Rapson from the Kresge Foundation, and a very dear friend, advisor, kitchen cabinet member, Maurice Cox, as we traveled through many different spaces and sectors to try to disrupt injustice in cities through different spaces and positions. The story of Detroit is a complex one, and probably a lot of people in this room have been drawn here because they've heard something about Detroit. Maybe they've been in recent years, but what gets put out about Detroit is always one side of the story. And today I've intentionally brought three sort of narratives of that story together. Sometimes they will be in complete alignment, and sometimes they may be a little bit contradictory. But that is the messiness and necessity of how cities move and transform. We've each participated in the city in different roles and responsibilities in different moments of time. And so this is meant to give you a little bit of arc of that. And for our students in the room, particularly to show you the ways with which this training as an architect, urban designer, and planner, and the way in which you can move between doing that work either as a private sector consultant, as a planning director, and how the sort of ebbs and flows of politics and working at the grassroots is never just a singular line. It's immensely complex and difficult work, but with the right team of people, immensely rewarding. So please allow me to read the resumes of our speakers this evening, Rip Rapson and Maurice Cox. Rip Rapson is president and CEO of the Kresge Foundation, a $3.6 billion private national foundation dedicated to building and strengthening pathways to opportunity for people with low incomes living in America's cities, including Kresge's hometown, Detroit. Since 2006, he has expanded the foundation's grant-making and investing tools to improve the economic, social, cultural, and environmental conditions of the city life along the nation and across the nation. He previously served as president of the McKnight Foundation in Minneapolis, where he led early childhood development efforts, created a regional public-private philanthropic economic development organization, and enhanced environmental protections along the Mississippi River. He earlier served as the deputy mayor of Minneapolis with responsibility for designing a $400 million neighborhood revitalization program, revamping the municipal budgeting process, and elevating the city's commitment to children and families. He is also the son of an architect, Ralph Rapson, so I think he's really delighted to be in this space with us today. Maurice Cox, Loeb Fellow 05. Mayor Mike Duggan selected Cox from among several national finalists to reorganize and lead the city's planning department in 2015. Cox, an urban planner, architectural educator, and architect, as well as another former mayor of the city of Charlottesville, Virginia, left a tenured position with Tulane University in New Orleans to accept the Detroit position. An outspoken advocate of neighborhood development, Cox told a Detroit audience at the Museum of Contemporary Art in February that he feels a responsibility to, quote, ensure the Detroiters who stuck it out in the hard times now share in the city's growing prosperity. Cox has taught at Syracuse University, the University of Virginia, and here at Harvard's Graduate School of Design. His experience merging architecture, politics, and design education led to his being named one of 20 Masters of Design in 2014 by Fast Company, where he led the NEA's Your Town Rural Institute, the Governor's Institute on Community Design, the Mayor's Institute on City Design, and oversaw design grants to the design community across the U.S. In 2013, Cox was named one of the most admired design educators in America in the annual ranking of Design Intelligence. So let's welcome our two speakers with a round of applause. Tonight's format, Rip Rapson will speak for about 40 or 45 minutes and give us a narrative of Detroit from his perspective, and then Maurice and I will join him in conversation for the remaining time, and we will be able to take questions and dialogue from the floor. So it's my great pleasure to bring Rip Rapson to the podium. Thank you.
Ever have the feeling that you've walked into the wrong room? I'm not a planner, I'm not an architect, and so the idea of sharing this stage with the two finest planners in America is, I've got to tell you, sort of utterly intimidating. And to make matters worse, Toni has invited a group of people who should actually be telling this story in my place. And so if people start making guttural noises as I talk, it's because they've had experience with Detroit. But as Toni noted, in some ways, Detroit is the kind of city where you almost have to suspend what you believe you know. It is neither come back, nor is it without hope. It is a narrative that is somewhere in between, constantly evolving. And I thought tonight, as Toni suggested, that it would be useful to look back before we looked forward. Maurice will, I think, just spin you around a couple of times with the kind of work that's being done through his office and through the mayor's office. But getting there was a complicated proposition, and I wanted to walk you through a little bit how we did get there. Second, just a quick disclaimer, because I am not an architect and I'm not a planner and I'm not able to show the beautiful slides that Maurice has. You're going to have to settle for a bunch of really primitive drawings. And for those architectural students in the audience, please forgive me. My father is rolling in his grave every time I put up one of these drawings. And I would say third that that if there is a theme in all of this, it is the interdependence and the mutuality of the different sectors in Detroit's recovery. I think it's tempting to think about the public sector, the private sector, even the civic sector, sort of being the dominant force in a community's renewal. But I think what you'll see, I hope what we can demonstrate tonight, is that it has taken all three of those sectors in different doses and different sequences and different weights to contribute to the Detroit story. Let me just first say a word about Kresge, and that I would maybe use this drawing as a way to encourage you not to look at them too carefully. They're impossible to read. They're even less possible to understand. But Kresge, for the better part of its 100-year history, built buildings. We gave capital to build buildings all across the country, everything from science centers to aquaria to art museums. And when I came about a decade ago to Kresge, the board was clearly interested in trying to shift away from sort of a one-tool-fits-all circumstances approach to something a little bit more complicated, nuanced, and appropriate to sort of a modern era. And so we developed both a place-based practice around Detroit, our hometown, where about a quarter of our time and a quarter of our dollars flowed. And in other cities across the country, we dropped down with issues ranging from health to the environment to human services to higher education. And so that's essentially what this drawing says. But back to Detroit. And let me pull back the clock to when I first arrived in 2006. In 2006, Detroit was actually in a period of rather extraordinary optimism. It had just reelected Kwame Kilpatrick. He was called the hip-hop mayor. He was elected at age 31, dynamic, smart, photographic memory kind of mayor who was deeply inspiring. And you could just sort of see the community sort of pulsing with the possibility that Mayor Kilpatrick was the kind of leader who would bring Detroit back from a 30, 40, 50-year decline. And for the first couple of years, it looked like that might well happen. The mayor was refinancing bonds, putting things up on the riverfront, surrounding himself with people who were really anxious to get the neighborhoods going again. But then 2008 happened. And in Detroit, 2008 was even worse than 2008 was in other communities across America. We suffered through the same Great Recession that everyone else did. We suffered through the same foreclosure crisis as everyone else did. But we also suffered through the automobile bankruptcies. And a lot of people, I think, forget that in 2008, 2009, the autos came within an inch of their life, with two of the autos declaring bankruptcy and the third, Ford Motor Company, essentially being in bankruptcy for all practical purposes. And if that weren't enough, Mayor Kilpatrick had a little sexting problem that turned into a very big problem. He was convicted and sent to the federal penitentiary together with about 35 of his colleagues. And so we were in a situation in 2008 and 2009 in which essentially the private sector was in a bunker, the public sector was essentially in jail, and the civic sector was just hanging on by a thread with no visible means of support. And it really called the question of whether private philanthropy, whether it was Kresge or the many other local community foundations in the city, could actually get their act together and step up. And I think there was an enormous hesitancy to do that. And for me, I was sort of forced off the ledge by three events that happened really almost within a month of each other. The first is we had a really tumultuous, difficult board meeting in which our trustees, 9 of the 12 of which do not live in Detroit and who read the national newspapers together with everyone else, said, "What in heaven's name are we doing here? This is too hard. These are dollars that could be spent somewhere easy, like Camden. Why would you sort of go down this rabbit hole? And when your board of directors sends you that message, you want to think about it." The second was I got a call from a guy named Derek Douglas. Derek was part of President Obama's Domestic Policy Council. The president had just been elected, 2009. And Derek called and said, Rip, I just came out of a cabinet meeting, and the president said to us that he will not permit Detroit to become the Katrina on his watch. And so we want to come to Detroit and announce something. And I said, well, that's terrific. What do you want to announce? He said, well, I don't know. You tell me. And I said, well, we probably need to talk about that a little bit. And so we did. But he said, essentially, the reason we don't know what to do is that it's so incoherent with all of these, all of these sort of forces moving in the wrong direction, political, economic, civic. We just can't make any sense of what's going on there. And so if you can figure out some ways in which we can be helpful, we'd appreciate it. And the third was a call I got from the Ford Foundation. A friend of mine at the Ford Foundation said, we have a new head of the Ford Foundation, Luis Urbinez. Luis is a McKinsey guy. He's from California. He has a background in communications, and he does not, for the life of him, see a future in Detroit for the Ford Foundation. So could you come out here and talk to him and try to convince him that he should stick with the program? Because Ford has always been, as you might imagine, having been its hometown, a deep supporter of the city of Detroit. So I did. I sat down with Luis, and in vintage McKinsey style, he heard me out a little bit, and I talked a little bit about some of the things we were working on. And he said, well, look, Rip, how much will private philanthropy spend in Detroit next year? And I realized I had never really calculated that, so I just sort of quickly scrolled through the small little foundations and Kresge and a little bit of Kellogg money, a little bit of Ford money, and I said, well, actually, it's probably about $175 million. And without even missing a beat, Luis then said, look, that means that in the next 7 years, philanthropy will spend $1 billion on the city of Detroit. What do you propose to buy with that money? And it was a little bit like Derek. I don't think we had an answer. And so I went back to my office because it struck me that there actually was more going on in Detroit than my board or the White House or the Ford Foundation knew, but that it was incoherent. There was sort of no sense of the whole being held in any way. And don't even think about trying to read this one, sorry. The point of this drawing was to try to identify nodes of activity in which there was real activity going on in the city. Real capital was moving, someone was stepping forward to take leadership, and that in the aggregate, these bodies of work might actually add up to something that would not be a comprehensive community agenda, but that would at least be the beginning of a community agenda. And as you scroll from left to right, it's everything from green and healthy neighborhoods to commercial corridor redevelopment to transit to education to arts and culture. And what I initially thought was that this was simply a way to help our board and our staff think a little bit more integratively about what we could or couldn't do. And as this drawing suggests, if we were to spend an hour with it, there actually were folks from all sectors in all ways sort of picking up, Andre, what are you doing here? I'm sorry, I was at a meeting this morning in Detroit, and Andre was our presenter, so. What?
Why are you here?
Yeah. Sorry for the rest of you, too much, this is way too much inside baseball. But what began as a conversation with my own board quickly became a conversation with our philanthropic colleagues. I was asked by virtually every philanthropic board in the city to come and just talk, because it became almost like a Rorschach test. They could actually locate themselves somewhere on this drawing. And when you take this drawing and you actually turn it vertically, you can build out work plans and paths of progress for each, which is exactly what we began to do. And we began to understand that the Skillman Foundation could sort of lead us through the education module, and the Hudson Weber Foundation could take the lead on establishing a new entrepreneurship program and the like. And so in some ways, we had the beginnings of the answer to what Derek and Luis had asked. It was essentially philanthropy getting on the same page, pulling in the same direction, and stepping up. The problem is, of course, that private philanthropy can't substitute for a responsible and responsive public sector, and it certainly can't do the same for an effective private sector. So it really became almost a form of scaffolding or buttressing, depending on how you think of it. Something that was sufficiently stable to hold the community as these other sectors regained their rightful position in the community, and that might indeed help us get through until then. So it's really tempting to talk about each of these 9, and I timed it out. We should be done by about 10:30, if that's all right. But I think I'm just going to talk about 3. I'm going to talk about land use, which is you can tell me, it's one of those modules. I'm going to talk about transit, and I'm going to talk about our work along the Central Corridor. Whoopsie, I didn't want to do that quite yet. Sorry. I gave away Tony's punchline. I'll come back to that in a second. Detroit, which was once almost 2 million residents, is now about 700,000 people, and they're scattered over 140 square miles. And that's a mass that could hold San Francisco, Boston, and Manhattan, with some room left over for St. Paul. It's simply not possible to spread municipal services across that expanse with anything resembling cost effectiveness. Of the city's 380,000 individual land parcels, some 75,000 were vacant at this point and blighted, consuming more than 50% of some of those communities. It made for an urban reality that was far too complex for traditional planning and land use development constructs to handle. And so in 2009, after we had worked through 4 mayors in less than a year, Mayor Dave Bing was elected. And he was elected on essentially a 2-part platform. One was anti-corruption, and he had the deepest of integrity. He was a former NBA basketball star. He had run a steel business for almost 30 years. Impeccable human being. And his second platform was to come to terms with this land use set of issues. And he called and he said, Rip, I just heard that Singapore did a master plan. Would you be willing to pay for that same guy to come to Detroit and do a master plan for us? And I said, no, I don't think that's such a good idea. I said, but what we would be willing to do, if you're willing to wait a month, is maybe we can assemble a team. We'll go down to New Orleans, talk to Maurice, and talk to folks down in New Orleans who have gone through a whole series of complicated engagements with how to reimagine a city and put in place a set of planning constructs that might work. And he agreed. We did that, came back, and essentially came to the relatively straightforward conclusion that it's both technical, complex urban planning and design, as well as deep and robust community engagement, and that the tension zone in the middle is where magic happens. The problem was we didn't have anyone to do it. And so sometimes you get lucky. I got an email in my box from a guy named Bill Potapchuk. Bill is someone I had worked with for years and years and years in Baltimore. And he said, well, word has it that you're looking for someone who could help you with a new planning process. And I said, yeah, really, we don't even know where to start. And he said, well, I've got someone I think might be interested. She's probably the finest planner in America. She did part of the Anacostia plan for the mayor of D.C. She's just coming off a stint with Cory Booker in Newark, and she's fabulous. And her name is Toni Griffin. So I said, don't know her. And she really is good as you think. And he said, go meet her, make your own judgment. So Toni and I, 10 years ago, next month, sat in Bryant Square, and I was mesmerized. And after about 38 seconds, I realized that this was the person we needed, if she were willing, to come to Detroit and help us out. And she was excited, I think. You can speak for yourself. But I think she was excited by the prospect. But she... This is getting way too intimate, you guys. The rest of you still here? Yeah. Andre, you want to get in the conversation? No, okay. But Toni was very, very clear that the only model that would work for her, or I think she believed for any community, was exactly what New Orleans had figured out, which is you assemble the best teams of expertise that you possibly can from around the world, in our case, and couple that with a community engagement process. So you create a virtuous loop of ideas being generated, ground truthed with community, community pushing back, community buying in, all of the things that you would think would happen. And so anyway, we were able to get Toni to come back. We introduced her all around at City Hall. Things were just hunky-dory. And then we had our first community meeting. And Toni, I won't talk too much about that first community meeting. It did not go well. All of the years of pent-up frustration and anger and lack of good process sort of all manifested in the first couple of meetings. And it was just a train wreck. It wasn't Toni's fault. It was just the way it was. And so in her eminent good judgment, she pulled back and tried to figure out how she could reach into community and find someone who had a legitimacy and experience and the smarts to run a community engagement process that would make sense. And that ended up being Dan Patero, who was sitting in the front row. Dan is a community organizing genius. He also is an architect and planner. He's associated with UD Mercy. And they designed a community engagement process that looked like an Obama political campaign. It was door knocking, it was in people's basements, it was electronic platforms, it was phone town halls, it was everything you could imagine. And they ultimately ended up touching and reaching into 100,000 Detroiters. It was really extraordinary. I'm going to gloss over all of the incredibly difficult moments between that and the time we produced a 435-page Detroit Future City Plan. But let me just suggest that it really got hard. That where we began with all of this excitement, Mayor Bing embracing Toni and her teams and Dan, ended up deteriorating almost from the get-go. It was a combination of insecurity on the part of City Hall, of complexity, of feeling that things were out of their control, of on and on and on. And it got to the point where we actually had to make the call that we were going to step away from City Hall for a while, either to cool people's jets or to rethink entirely what we were up to. I think there were points when Toni, again, speak for yourself, but I think there were points at which Toni was prepared to walk away. It was just too hard and people were being too petty and too difficult. But she agreed to stay the course. We pulled it out of City Hall. We ran it essentially on a parallel track. Toni continued doing the analysis. Dan continued to organize. We created community advisory teams, and somehow we muscled our way through it. And by the time we announced the plan in late 2012, early 2013, it enjoyed the support, the deep support of community in a way I think we could never have expected. When we announced the plan, it was 4 or 5 things in one. First, it was a 435-page plan full of all of the most complicated and in-depth analyses as appendices that you could possibly imagine. All of those clouds and lines represent the different chapters of the plan, and it went from everything from ecological landscapes to economic centers to compact competitive neighborhoods and the like. But when we announced, we did a couple of things that I think helped ensure that the plan wouldn't die the same death that all plans do, which was we essentially committed to a continuing community engagement process. We felt that this was a plan that needed to live and evolve and kind of continue to recycle through the neighborhood. We set up a governance structure outside of City Hall, which violated every rule of urban planning and engagement I think I've ever heard of. But we worked with these community advisory councils. We made them essentially the governing board. And they stepped up and they agreed, and they were some of the most respected community leaders in Detroit. We created a project management office, essentially a staffed office who would wake up every day trying to think about the plan, what it meant, where it might be applied, how it could be modified, how to continue to engage the community in it. And finally, we created an investment commitment, and Kresge said that every dollar of its $150 million that it would spend in Detroit over the next 5 years would be spent in a way that was consistent with the plan. And so I think those things in combination ended up making sure that we had a plan that would, in fact, live beyond its issuance in January of 2013, and it has. And I think Maurice and Toni can talk more about how that has happened. But I think it is safe to say that for the first couple of years, it became the defining way of thinking about land use in the city. I think Mayor Duggan's administration began to develop its own ideas about where to go first and where to go fifth, but that in fundamental ways, it was entirely consistent with the plan. So let me quickly then turn to the second module, which is transit. You know, if there were ever a city in America that was hostile to transit, it would be Detroit. We, I believe, are the only major metropolitan area in the country without essentially an effective, seamless mass transit system. It is criminal. Worse than criminal, if there is something worse than criminal. The legislature had tried some 40 times since the World War II to pass regional transit legislation, and 44 out of 44 times it failed. And it was just a mess. And so one of the first conversations I had when I came to Detroit was with a guy named Roger Penske. Penske was one of our most revered public leaders. He had masterminded Detroit's hosting of the Super Bowl, and he was really looking for his next sort of big civic engagement. And I didn't know who Roger was. In retrospect, if I had, I wouldn't have gone to lunch with him. I mean, it was terrifying. The guy is really extraordinary. But I sat with him, and he said, all right, well, what should I do? And I said, well, I've been here all of 2 months, but we have this 8-lane highway that runs right in the middle of Detroit. It's called Woodward Avenue. It's the first paved highway in America, by the way. It's called M1, Michigan 1. And it is way more road than any community needs, and it was certainly way more road than Detroit needed in 2006 and 2007. I think there were 7 cars on it at one point. It was a tough time in Detroit, and it was just a classic sort of overbuilt road. And I said, why don't we just take the public right away and run transit up and down it, and that can do any number of things. It connect all of the parts of the major corridor. You've got arts organizations, educational organizations, commercial organizations. You can kind of get from one to another. It's about a 3-mile stretch, 3.5-mile stretch between the Midtown area and downtown. It can begin to encourage land use around the stops. It can be, and most importantly, it can be the first move in the creation of a long-term regional transit plan, because if you take it up to Midtown, it connects to an Amtrak station that connects to Ann Arbor, which in turn connects to the north to a rail line that connects to the job centers to the north. At any rate, Roger was very polite and nodded and left. But then a couple of months later, he called and he said, you know, I've been having a conversation with the head of the Regional Transit Advisory Committee. We didn't have an authority, but we had an advisory committee. And he's sort of intrigued by this idea. So would you give us some money to do an engineering study for for this? And I said, sure, of course. Yeah. And so we gave him enough money to do an engineering study. And many months later, Roger calls one more time and said, all right, we've got the engineering study. Why don't you come to a meeting and we'll talk about it? And I said, well, what did you conclude? And he said, well, come to the meeting. We'll talk about it. And so I came to the meeting and they talked about it. And it ended up coming to the conclusion that you could build this light rail line from the river downtown all the way up to Midtown for about $100 million. On one hand, that sounds like a lot of money, but when you think about what the per mile cost is of any subway project, light rail project, it seemed pretty cheap. And so I was encouraged, and Roger then said to me, he said, but there's just one thing. We need you to put in the first $35 million. I said, well, why? He said, well, if you put in the first $35 million, he said, we'll do naming rights for the other, we'll do for all the stations, and because I'm in the leasing and the truck business, we'll figure out how to do the moving freight, and we'll do leases and get it all done. And so it was sort of one of those moments of truth. We're a private foundation. We invest in human services and buildings, and now we're going to build a light rail line. And that was kind of a revelation to our board. And so we said yes. And the good news was that we went about the business of putting together a private philanthropic partnership. Soon thereafter, we found out that the city of Detroit had its own ideas, that it was going to run essentially a commuter rail line all the way down from 8 Mile, the city limits, all the way down and then up into the burbs. They weren't sure how they were going to pay for it, but that was their plan. And that was about an $800 million plan. And so we spent a lot of time trying to figure out how these two plans could mesh together. And that led to the one story I want to relay that I think, again, suggests the complexity of the interweaving of these sectors. We thought we had worked out something with the city. We would run the light rail up to Midtown. The city would then take the rail from there on out and make it commuter rail. It would only do very few stops. And so 2 systems. It wasn't ideal, but it was a start on this regional system. And so Secretary Ray LaHood was going to give the city $25 million of Tiger grants to get this thing going. So Ray LaHood comes to town only to find that the city of Detroit doesn't have the authority to bond for its part of the project. And he was furious. He had never been told that there might be an issue, and he just said, well, I'm done. That's ridiculous. And so I woke up to a morning newspaper article saying, light rail project dead, $25 million going to Governor Schneider. And essentially what LaHood had decided would he'd give it to the governor and they would use it for bus rapid transit. So I got a call from Roger Penske, and he said, Rip, we got to be done. This is, you've got the Federal Transit Administrator, you've got the Secretary of Transportation, you've got the governor, you've got the mayor, all telling us we can't build this thing. And to make a very long story short, we decided to ask for one last chance. And so we called LaHood and asked if he would come and bring his entire staff. We'd get our entire congressional delegation, both senators, the governor, everybody we could in the room, and make one last pitch. And the reason I tell this story is that it wasn't going quite so well until Penske finally just looked at LaHood and he said, look, we're going to raise $130 million for this project, private money. It'll qualify us for New Start's money that we would not otherwise be eligible for. Why don't you give us 6 months and we will show you that we can build this. And LaHood looked at Penske, who was a very impressive guy, and said, all right, Mr. Penske, if you can meet every condition that the FDA administrator will impose, we will give you your $25 million of Tiger grants. And at that point, his legal counsel rose out of her chair, put her hand on the secretary, and said, Mr. Secretary, you cannot make that commitment. And he said, and why not? And he said, because you've already committed this money to the governor, and there's no more money to commit. You can't commit to going and finding more money. he nodded, and she sat down, and he looked at Roger Penske, and he said, "Mr. Penske, I commit to you that if you complete this in 6 months, yeah, we will do it." So essentially, they certified the conditions. We met them. It took us a little bit longer. We ended up raising almost $170 million. We had every engineering complexity, every political complexity you can imagine. But in fact, the light rail line did open in 2017, and we continue to hope that it will be the first leg of a regional transit system. I'm going to speed up now. This is the third module, and I'm just going to quickly talk about this. This is the concentration and alignment along the Woodward corridor of a whole suite of investments that we felt were important to stabilize the corridor and to essentially begin the flywheel of tax base creation that the city needed in order to begin moving forward. As you can see, sort of circling around, it's everything from arts and culture stabilization. We had to put money in to make sure that both the DIA and the orchestra could meet their bills. It's the light rail project. It was a suite of other things. But I want to just talk about one thing quickly because Ben Heck is here. Ben Heck runs Living Cities. And Ben, a number of years ago, decided that Living Cities, which is a consortium of federal foundations and banks, was going to start something called the Integration Initiative, in which they would try to get the banks and the foundations to pick 4 communities in which they could blend their loan capital and their grant capital and really have impact. Didn't go quite so well in Baltimore and Newark and Minneapolis, but in Detroit, it was transformative. Because what Ben did in his wisdom was to say, what we're going to do is double down on your ability to do community lending and community investment. And so they gave us grant money to capitalize something called Midtown Inc., which was our major CDC. They got almost $20 million of loan capital from the banks to move into complex, difficult deals. And Kresge, in turn, created a couple of vehicles that permitted us to do sort of first risk loss protection and get some of these projects off the ground. It is almost impossible to overstate the impact on that. When Ben made his investment in Midtown Inc., they had 3 staff people. They now have 30. And it was a direct outcome of that investment, because once they could get the development flywheel going, they could use the development fees to pay for their operating costs and sort of recycle them into the next project and the next project, next project. And the renaissance that you're seeing all up and down the Woodward Corridor Avenue today is I think, a direct result of that. 10 minutes. Okay, well then let me do something quite different. That scaffolding essentially held until 2012. And then the bankruptcy hit Detroit. And I was going to walk you through all sorts of complicated slides on the bankruptcy. Let me give you the really, really short version, which I think is maybe the handoff to Toni and to Maurice. We often think of the Detroit bankruptcy that was declared in 2013 as simply long-term debt obligations, bonds, pensions, and the like. That's the first pillar of this drawing. But as in equal parts, it was in equal parts a need to restructure city services because they were badly out of balance and couldn't be put into balances. The costs of doing business in the city of Detroit were consistently overrunning the revenues. And third, the bankruptcy judge said, it does me no good to agree to a plan that restructures your long-term debt, and even to a plan that balances your books, if I don't have confidence that over the long term, we have in place the building blocks for the quality of life that this community needs, because otherwise we're going to be back in bankruptcy court in a matter of years. And so, yeah, for those of you who are interested, this is the grand bargain. Essentially, what we did was to generate almost $380 million of philanthropic capital that took the 2 assets that were in play in the bankruptcy, the pensions of our pensioners and the public art, both of which were at risk by the creditors, and essentially protected both in a mechanism I can talk to folks afterward about. This all worked up into a long-term plan of adjustment, which was the fancy document that essentially carried investments that the city could take forward coming out of the bankruptcy in a suite of investments in housing, public safety, transit, technology, and the like. The second part of the bankruptcy was balancing the city's books. What this drawing essentially shows you is that all 7 of the major platform elements that Mayor Duggan ran on, Mayor Duggan was running in 2013, are essentially articulated here. Every single one of those was in the works in a way that drew in both the private sector and the philanthropic sector, and ultimately helped structure the plan of adjustment. And so our emergency manager essentially took those 7 pillars and gave both executive orders and new capital to give the new administration a running head start. And let me just do one more story, Toni, and then I'll wrap up. I got another call right at the beginning of the bankruptcy, this time from Gene Sperling, who is the head of the Council on Economic Advisors for President Obama. And Gene said, Rip, we are really sympathetic to you guys in Detroit. We really want to help with the bankruptcy. We still don't want Detroit to be the Katrina on our watch. And so we want to come to Detroit to announce something. And I said, what is it with you guys coming to announce things all the time? And I said, what do you want to announce? He said, I don't know. We'll come and figure it out. And I said, please, Gene, do not do that. Why don't we give us 2 weeks. We'll send you a working paper on what we believe the sort of the signature bodies of investment might be based on what we know of the federal government. You take that, circulate it around, and maybe we can come up with something. So he said, fine. We sent it to him. I got another call, come on out. And so I come out with Penske and Dan Gilbert and a bunch of other people to the Roosevelt room, expecting to see Gene and a couple of his staff people. It was the entire Obama cabinet. Every single cabinet secretary was sitting there. And we spent 3 hours going through that white paper, from housing to transit to safety. The Attorney General was there, trying to figure out how the federal government could, without legislation, without forgiving bonds, find some excess capacity in government to, oh, that was not, I thought you were going to give me another little thing. No, okay. I'm almost done. Okay. How the federal government could be helpful. We reacted. He then took it back, created a bunch of interagency cabinets. They refined it. And within a month, he was able to come to Detroit, and he announced a $300 million package that involved everything from a new blight task force that is a whole nother story, to money for bus renovations, to police equipment that the Attorney General had found in San Antonio. I mean, it was just remarkable. And it was just another example of how the philanthropic sector, the private sector, the federal sector all joined to sort of take us out of the bankruptcy. The last thing I will say is that the third part of the bankruptcy was this quality of life question. And the bankruptcy judge asked 3 of us to testify at the bankruptcy hearing, the final bankruptcy hearing, about what we believed the city would need in order to survive into the future. And Penske Gilbert talked about his investments downtown. Dan Gilbert is the head of Quicken Loans, who moved his headquarters downtown. And I suggested that in the pre-bankruptcy era, philanthropy had essentially played 6 broad roles, and that it had resulted in all of this swirl of activity on this drawing, many of which I've just described. But I said, more importantly, that going forward, I believed that those same 6 roles would be played out in the future of the city, and that the judge should have confidence that the way we had worked before the bankruptcy would be essentially the way we worked after the bankruptcy. And when Mayor Duggan was elected in 2013, there was, I think, a huge expectation that we would sort of revert to form, that we would go back into sort of a command and control municipal structure where the mayor was in charge of everything. The mayor is in charge of everything. But what I think has happened instead is this very nuanced, beneficial resorting and recalibration of roles and responsibilities that in fact reflects what was done pre-bankruptcy. And if I had the time, what I would walk you through is how each of those roles played before the bankruptcy and afterward. First is table setting, the ability of philanthropy to take on the really tough issues of a community and forge a sort of an independent, arm's length set of conversations in community. Before the bankruptcy, it was Detroit Future City. After the bankruptcy, it's early childhood development. And this is just a depiction of the work we're doing with the Kellogg Foundation to try to create an early childhood development system. The second was strengthening civic capacity. Before the bankruptcy, it had a lot to do with community lending, the kind of community development finance institutions that Ben was able to bring to our community, bucking up the community development corporations that were the strongest. Post-bankruptcy, it will be investing in neighborhood capacity. This is a ridiculous drawing that simply suggests that the kind of capacity building that we're going to have to look at from here on out has to do with community organizing, it has to do with community power building, it has to do with agency, it has to do with a lot of things that are much more granular, much more complex, much more particular to circumstance. The third broad role was peeling away the first layer of risk. Before the bankruptcy, that manifested in a series of discrete transactions. We could invest in a building project or in a green grocers fund. I would suggest that in the post-bankruptcy era, it's going to be much more about broadening the aperture of risk and taking on entire neighborhoods. And we can talk a little bit with Maurice about one of the primary examples that we're now undertaking, which is up in the northwest quadrant of the city, in which in one area called Livernois 6 Mile, Live 6, we're combining housing strategy, open space strategy, small business development strategy, open space strategy, and a very interesting preschool through graduate school complex on an old HBCU site that we have, in the last couple of years, helped turn around. The fourth role is serving as a guarantor of value, simply signaling through investments in common public space to the private sector that their money will see return over the long term. Classic examples are investing in things like a waterfront, where we have a 7-mile river walk in Detroit, or the light rail line. I think the next generation will be the pursuit of the regional transit process. We lost by a 0.5 percentage point in 2016 on a major regional transit initiative. We were thwarted again last year, but we're going to go back at it in 2020, and I'm pretty sure this time we'll be successful. The fifth role is simply acting as a seller. Philanthropy has had the ability pre-bankruptcy to be a bridge to national intellectual resources, national capital, and it was a powerful thing at a time when we needed that kind of bridging activity. Going forward, it just seems to me that Detroit needs to resume its sort of rightful place as a part of a national urban learning cycle. We are involved in a process in which we're working with 6 other cities, the Urban Institute, the Brookings Institute, Living Cities, the Aspen Institute, and trying to sort of take some of the lessons we've learned from Detroit, see their application, if any, to other communities, and then pull back some of their most interesting practices back in Detroit. And finally, serving as a steward of really fragile ecologies. At the end of the day, there are very few people who are going to invest in an arts ecology, a food systems ecology, or a human services ecology. It really does fall to sort of a classic philanthropic role. And so before the bankruptcy, we spent an enormous amount of time and money and energy creating what I think is now a very robust arts and cultural ecology. Going forward, I think we're going to have to do the same thing with human services. It's a very complex set of questions around safety net, next generation Foundation practice on providing for human development needs and the like. So I'm sorry to have moved quite so quickly, but I think in some, the yeah, right. In some, the arc of Detroit is both, I think, unique and emblematic. I think it is unique for all the reasons you can imagine and all the reasons I've suggested. But it really is emblematic in the sense of creating, I think, an imperative for a very different way of making decisions in the future of our most complex urban areas. It simply has to be distributive. It has to be community-based. It has to be multi-sectoral. It has to be rooted in issues of racial equity and opportunity. And it's just a different way of doing businesses. The good news is I think a lot of communities in the country are doing exactly that, and some are doing it quite effectively. But in Detroit, you have, I think, the opportunity to get out in front of what it means to recover inclusively. We can just let the large corporate interests continue to sort of drive the Woodward corridor model into our neighborhoods, but that's not going to work. It doesn't work for 10 reasons. Instead, what we've got to do is exactly what Mayor Duggan has been doing and Maurice has been doing, which is to figure out highly nuanced, granular, community-particular kinds of interventions that blend exactly what Toni started us off with. All of the best thinking at the most complicated and sophisticated levels with the wisdom and knowledge and values of community. And I think that's what you're going to see coming out of Detroit. And I think it bodes really well for the future of our community. Thank you, Toni.
Are these on? Fantastic. Thank you, Rip. I always learn a new dimension of the story when I hear you tell the story, and I wish we had another half hour for you to continue to elaborate. But thank you for sharing that. And what Rip didn't say is that one of those diagrams he actually pulled out of his pocket at our meeting at Bryant Park and put on the table and walked me through. And in my first 38 seconds, I knew this was someone that I could collaborate with, not as a traditional kind of client-consultant relationship, but really as a collaborator. So again, thank you for putting your trust in me and joining your work. So we're going to have a little bit of back and forth, and I'm going to ask a question. I'm going to throw it to Maurice first to kind of react to some of this. And then I just want us to free flow. So if you want to just kind of go in the dialogue from there. But, you know, the time in which we started the work together in 2009, 2010, many systems and structures had devolved, and there was deep distrust across different sectors. And you described some of the unraveling of the public sector, and then every other sector kind of fell into their own silo. Community organizations were out there doing their thing and making things happen, philanthropy, business. No one was really cutting across, and there was not a lot of trust across those. Quite frankly, you guys were the white guys in Troy, right? So even that, you were an outsider even in your own insider kind of space. And so there were certain necessities and survival tactics at play around this distributed leadership. And then there were other sort of dynamics to that led us to bifurcate a long-range planning process and a near term as government was trying to regain a sense of certainty and trust with its constituents. And it reminds me of when I went to DC after my LOPE fellowship to be a deputy planning director under then Mayor Tony Williams, who was taking over as mayor of DC after receivership, where all the functions of government were kind of doled out to others to do, and there was no trust in government. So Duggan is elected the first white mayor in the city in some 40 some odd years. He begins to, unlike previous administration, welcome outside talent alongside local talent to work, and Maurice is tapped to be its planning director. So Maurice, you walk into this decentralized distributed leadership model and a space where an extraordinary amount of capital and leadership had to be tapped and put in some places, uncomfortable positions in order to make some big moves to pivot off of what was a fairly rapid and disorganized decline. So maybe you can talk to us, you entered the scene, maybe you can talk to us a little bit about what it was like to re-enter that space that was decentralized. A new mayor comes on, there's great energy and enthusiasm for this, and you need to reestablish confidence with your constituents that government can perform the functions that it is intended to do, and how can it reassume its leadership role. So talk to us about what that was like.
Yeah. So after I received all of the condolences for the job that I had just taken, I really started to wonder, what I got myself into, because I came to a city that had not done planning, arguably in decades. There were 6 planners in the office for a city of 670,000 people. I remember walking into the implementation office that Detroit Future City set up. They had 12 planners, and I had 6. And so I said, okay. And then I walked into the office of Dan Gilbert and Quicken Loans, and they had about 30 planners. And then I walked into the Downtown Detroit Partnership, and they had 12. And it became very obvious that there was no level playing field here, and that unless I started to build the capacity of the public to play its rightful role as implementer of a vision, that we wouldn't be able to really make progress. So Mayor Duggan asked me, so what does the landscape look like? And I said, well, it's pretty depleted. And the only way that I could turn things around is if I can kind of build the muscle of planning and design in Detroit. And he said, so what is it going to take to do that? And I said, well, it could start with maybe giving me permission to hire 30, 40 new planners for the city. And I do remember it because he said, okay, so what does a planner do? And he was serious. He wanted to know what I would do with 40 planners every hour of the day for the entire week for months. And long story short, I made the case. And today I have 40 planners, and they are planners, urban designers, architects, landscape architects, historians, PhDs, working in the Office of Planning and Development. And so that was the first thing. I mean, what you heard is philanthropy played an enormous, oversized role in taking Detroit forward. I would argue that the private sector stepped in and played an enormous role. The entity that really had been just depleted was the public role. And I think the first thing I had to understand is that there's a need to shift roles, change places, in any recovery process that is a long-term recovery process. So I thought that Kresge played the role it needed to play at that time. Dan Gilbert and General Motors played the role that they needed to play at that time. It was now time for the city of Detroit to play its role. And that's kind of what we did. I mean, there is an enormous shifting of roles going on in Detroit now. And I would argue a level of alignment that this city has not seen in decades. And it's that alignment that is starting to accelerate the process and change the narrative that we hear about Detroit today. Does that sound fair?
More than fair. I thought you were going to be much more hostile.
This is being taped, right?
And broadcast live.
No, absolutely. I mean, Mayor Duggan, for those of you who haven't followed Detroit, is just a supremely gifted administrator. He understands complex systems. He's not threatened by talent. He is fully prepared to reach out when he needs help. And I think in that setting, exactly the kind of recalibration that Maurice has described is what falls into place. Just a quick example. The mayor was very frustrated, has been very frustrated, that it's very difficult to buy a home, to get a loan in Detroit for a home, because you get a home for $5,000, you need $50,000 of rehab, and no one will lend against that. So he came up with this idea of developing a home mortgage program, where somehow that gap would be lendable, because housing values over time would rise, and the bank should see that and be willing to lend against that. Big idea. And yet he couldn't execute against it. And so he brought it into the Clinton Global Initiative, the domestic version of it, said, I want philanthropy and the banks and the public sector to sit in this room for the next 2 days until we figured it out. And he sat with us for 2 days, and we figured it out. And essentially, Kresge came in and guaranteed a gap. The banks agreed to take a much higher risk. The public sector agreed to sort of exercise over supervision and oversight. And it seems to me it was sort of a good example of almost reverse engineering. You've sort of certified a question, and then you back up and say, all right, what can each of the sectors do against that? And I think as you circle around virtually every priority that the mayor has articulated in the city, there is some version of that going on. And I think that that is actually remarkable. Most mayors, I think, would not either have the flexibility to do that or the humility to do that. But I think, and I don't mean to deify the mayor, but I think he deserves great credit for understanding that he has these very vibrant sectors now who are capable of helping him move forward.
So I'm going to put two questions on the table at the same time, and then I have one last one before I ask the audience to chime in. And it's still in this kind of space of sort of shifts around the table, right? So one was around kind of leadership. The other two shifts are the shifts of planning scale. So on the front end of bankruptcy and the grand bargain, the notion that you could start planning at the neighborhood scale when systems were so broken, right? And there was no real path forward for how to manage the steep slope, that there had to, and you described, the White House wanted to help and others wanted to help, but you had no larger vision that could direct the way for that help to come in. So the necessity of needing to look citywide as a scale and outside of just the month 0 to 12 was an important step that needed to be taken at that time. Post the bankruptcy, and because that was set as a citywide scale with a way in which neighborhoods could then on their own and with their own capacity plan at that scale for themselves, Maurice has been able to put together extraordinary planning office that can then do that work with communities, right? So I want you to talk a little bit about why that shift was so important. And the other shift is moving from, at the time, we were coming out of recession, there was the automobile crisis, and the term of legacy cities was born, right? And we were trying to talk about how do cities like that have another future, cities that have lost greater than 20% of their population? right? So Detroit at the time, a city of 713,000 people, still the 18th largest city in the country, it wasn't going anywhere, and still needed a vision for how to be a fantastic, the best 700,000 person city. Right? But now, dug in on the other side of bankruptcy, and I remember in his first days was like, we're going to grow the population again, right? And how do we do that? So I also want to kind of talk about how, in fact, you do that and still manage what is still kind of an ebb and flow of losing population, still trying to grow an economy, and how that's maybe being negotiated across the different sectors that are still playing a part in that.
Wow. So I think the reason Mayor Duggan chose me is because he had heard that I know how to work with residents, and that I can bring them to a place to do things that perhaps they didn't think was possible. And this is largely kind of looking at New Orleans and my time there, working with residents through the Tulane City Center. And so he was confident that we could not afford to lose another single resident. When he took over the city, we were still losing 1,000 residents a month. This is 2013. Today, it is a trickle, and we are confident that the 2020 census is going to show that Detroit is growing again. So his notion was that if you're not growing, then you're dying. So growth was a part of the strategy. He never, ever bought into the scenario that we were a shrinking city, because he knew full well we still were responsible for 139 square miles, and we would never be able to give that up. So his mindset was, I want to grow the city, but by the way, Maurice, I want to retain every Detroiter who stuck it out with us through thick and thin. And I want you to plan, but I want you to plan with those folks. Don't plan for the future growth. Make this place a place where Detroiters are genuinely proud to live and they have a high quality of life. And so that means a lot of hours, a lot of evening meetings. We tally our meetings. We did 230 evening meetings just last year. And they were in neighborhoods all across the city. And so what I found was Detroiters, because they could not rely on government, had become incredibly resilient, incredibly self-sufficient. They were self-organized. All you had to do is post, you're having a meeting, and a couple of hundred people would show up, determined to be a part of a conversation. I would argue that the work that the Detroit Future Cities did set the stage for that. Those 100,000 people who were touched, they knew what to do. They could set up the room. They will be heard. And so we just had to create an environment where they felt they were being listened to, that they could trust government again to be an honest broker. And so I think we are making progress in earning residents' trust. And so I don't know, I feel that the strategy that has been strolling as we've been talking has to do with a different mindset. I mean, we talk about a beautiful Detroit now. You know, people in Detroit were accustomed, they were trained to think that their city wasn't beautiful. And this was a national narrative that had overcome the city. So we talk about beauty, we talk about health, we talk about inclusion, we talk about affordability, we talk about density. That's a tough one. We talk about bike lanes. That's even tougher. We're talking about the kind of quality of life amenities that any healthy city would talk about. And that has been a paradigm shift in the city of Detroit. And so for me, it feels really, really normal. What's unusual is that when we hold a meeting, like 99% of the people in the room are Black. And to talk about protected bike lanes 10 miles from downtown in an audience full of my folk is quite an incredible experience. So anyway, I think in many ways, it feels like it's normal. It's normal. Detroit is not the poster child for American city decline.
Yeah.
In fact, within a very short period of time, that narrative has shifted to it becoming an extraordinary laboratory for reinventing the city.
I mean, it's amazing to me thinking about where we were, Rip, and doing Detroit Future City, to turn around even short of 4 or 5 years out, that you are hard pressed to read the kind of national narrative story about Detroit that we did. So, I mean, I just find it really quite extraordinary. And so the continuum, I think, of the work, I think, has been a big part of that.
You asked about the scale, and it. I think it is impossible to overstate the skill and the credibility that Maurice has introduced into these community conversations. But and he is having to sort of manage a sort of a difficult question of scale, because he's got to work across all of the neighborhoods. There is a future for every neighborhood is one of the favorite things that the mayor likes to say. And so 260 meetings is part of the job description, as impossible, backbreaking as that is. So I think that there is still then room underneath that for one of the remember that goofy slide with all those machines, was trying to suggest that there needs to be a civic infrastructure that works at a different scale. Not that Maurice doesn't. I mean, his planners and he himself are in particular communities developing neighborhood plans or corridor plans and all that. But you still need community development organizations. You still need block club networks. You still need community development lending capacity. And it seems to me that one of the role shifts, Toni, I think to your question, if I'm interpreting it correctly, is that the alignment that philanthropy now is able to do with the public sector is to say, you guys really should and do steward the broad sweep. And we can then pick our moments underneath, helping build certain kinds of civic capacity, finding a particular geography in which there's a ripeness for the kind of intervention that I mentioned in the Livernois 6-mile area. And it becomes I think a complementary set of relationships, because the 40 folks who come to Maurice's Monday night meeting then go back out into community and need to do the work. And so organizing around block clubs, trying to figure out what kind of housing development capacity they can call on and on and on. So and that's just not a weave that we had in Detroit. Yeah. There was neither the ground level nor the air cover. And I think now we have both.
So I'm going to ask my one last question and then take questions from the floor. And I feel like I need to ask this in the context of the Just City Assembly that we are convening here today. And, you know, the work of the lab, where I'm really kind of propositioning justice versus equity. And I'm rooted in justice because I firmly understand, recognize, appreciate, see in my work the role of race. So we're in a Black city, Detroit, which is why I want to talk about it as a part of the convening, 82% African American. And in the assembly, we are creating space to talk really openly, honestly, about the role of race, how we deal with it personally, as it influences how we work and the constituents we work with. So Maurice, as a Black man, given the opportunity to work here, and Rip, as a white man, working in a Black city. If you can each just maybe spend a few minutes and just talk about the joys, challenges, stresses, and benefits of that, and how you are negotiating that, how you're enjoying it, how you situate yourself in it to be effective at what you do, and then I will open it up to the audience for questions.
Yeah, well, that's a good one. So a lot of the early work that Rip articulated was concentrated at the heart of the city, in its downtown and its midtown. And one might argue, if you just look at the history of city revitalizations, they emanate from the heart, from the downtown. It belongs to everyone. The soul of Detroit is in its neighborhoods. And so I think so much of what we talked about in terms of the riverfront, in terms of the light rail, in terms of housing and mixed-use startup, was all happening in a geography of about 7.2 square miles of a city that has 139 square miles. And the racial composition of that 7.2 square miles is the exact opposite of what Detroit is. It's about 80% white and 20% minority. The other 131 square miles is the Black Detroit. It's 80% plus 90% African American. My 40 planners and I, we work in that other 131 square miles. And so as a Black man, I feel incredibly comfortable and thrilled to be in an audience when I hold a community meeting and I'm talking about these progressive ideas like protected bike lanes and super wide sidewalks and mixed income housing. And I'm talking to a Black audience. And what's amazing is their receptivity to these ideas. I mean, they like everyone, have to work through their resistance. But with time, they get it. And it's phenomenally empowering, and there's a sense of optimism about that. Now, I think the challenge is the type of recovery that you see in neighborhoods is much more granular. It's not flashy. There are no big cranes in the air. It's small public spaces. It's living room meetings, porch meetings. It's coffee shops. A new coffee shop opens in your neighborhood, and you walk in, and there are folks that look like me with their laptops open, and they're, hanging out in the same type of thing we all like to do. It's lots being activated. It's really kind of fine grained. So sometimes you miss that. And so I still have to push back on this narrative that downtown gets everything and, the neighborhoods get nothing. Everything you're seeing above me is in the neighborhoods. And we made a very distinct, decision to focus quality in the built and natural environment in these neighborhoods, by the way, where folks like me live. And so I think that's kind of where we are. I would love to know what it's like to be a white man in Detroit during this time.
Terrific. You had the old straight white guy answering the question on racial equity. That's terrific. The challenge, I think, is that in a lot of old white guys' heads is the narrative that we have to promote an inclusive recovery. In a community that is 82% Black and 10% Hispanic, that's a funny frame when you think about it. Really? What we need is a recovery that deconstructs the impediments to opportunity and reconstructs them with the face of Detroit, right? And Andre was talking about that this morning. I mean, you go right at the housing issues. How do people build wealth through housing? Through small business development, through asset transfer programs, whatever it is. And I think in Detroit, whether you're the planning director or whether you're a foundation out in the burbs. The fundamental proposition of sort of taking on these sort of structural underpinnings is everything. I mean, we can go and do window dressing. That's not what Maurice is doing. And I'd like to think that's not what we're doing. I think we really are, through whether it's a home mortgage program or through a small business loan fund or through an open space program that permits residents to have the same access to open space as residents downtown do. I think it's sort of taking this sort of systems look. And I think for too long, philanthropy was content to skim. We were intent to sort of go sort of at the surface level, treat everyone the same, sort of create broad structures of access and opportunity. And that just doesn't work in a community in which the kinds of racial impediments to progress Detroit has had. I mean, you just got to go after the racial underpinnings of this stuff. And it means it's very complicated. It means that my staff has to be culturally competent. We have a staff of 8 for our Detroit program. 6 are people of color. They live in the community, they work in the community, they know the community, they have credibility in the community. And so I just think it is, I'd like to think it's not so different from the perspective that Maurice has just articulated.
So we do have, I know we're over, but hopefully we can take a few questions from the floor if people have them. I see your hands, but I just want to make sure I preference a student first if I see a student hand. But I don't, so I'm going to go to Jason.
Hi, so impressive and exciting to hear you guys tell this story. Since I'm not at the federal government anymore, I'm curious what it's like to work with this federal government. And if you're getting the same level of support, or because I think there's sort of some falsehoods that this government isn't doing anything, but I'm curious if it's true or not. So.
You're kidding.
I don't know.
I mean, I would just say, we have to work with who's ever in office. So at the state level, we had a Republican governor. I think we got extraordinary work done under Governor Snyder. There is no replacing the relationship we had with the Obama administration. I don't think that will happen again. And when I say that, he bailed out the auto industry that allowed us to progress and be able to announce, last year that the Ford Motor Company would be moving into Detroit with 5,000 jobs in the Michigan train station. Obama sustained that to allow that kind of thing to happen. He also embedded in the government of Detroit four officers. So when I arrived there, we had 4 officers from the Obama administration that were there every week. And they were our conduit to all kinds of unprecedented access. Needless to say, when the Obama administration left, so did those 4, so did those resources. So I can't say too much about the good things that we're getting out of this current administration, but I can talk for days about Obama.
Nice try, Jason.
Thank you. You're a very charismatic person, and I would come to any of your meetings in a heartbeat. But what did you do at the beginning to overcome this deep cynicism that I felt people had toward local and really every level of government?
Yeah, no, I definitely remember those first meetings being very, very tough. The color of my skin might have gotten me an audience with the community, but as soon as it was over. That's it. That was it. I may have gotten them in the door, but then you've got to prove your worth. I mean, I just remember, these seniors, these elders in the community would come to these meetings, and they had done their homework. They had read up on me. And they said, so I know what you're about. I'm going to be watching you, young man. And so it was that kind of just genuine love. But it has taken years to earn that trust. Detroiters don't give their trust easily because their hopes have been dashed so often. So we win their trust because, one, our planners look like them. About 60% of the people in the planning department are people of color. 70% of them live in the community they plan in. And they are the sons and daughters and nieces and nephews of the people who come to our meetings. And we're there to listen. And, when you come to a community meeting and the tenure of the people there are 30, 40, 50, 60 years in those communities. So, who is the expert? Just tell me, who would be the expert in that case? And I acknowledge that in every word I speak to them. They understand that we are co-creating these strategies, that I'm going to bring some new ideas that are going to challenge them, and they're going to challenge me. And so I think we now trust each other a little more, and they're willing to say, be patient. Another one I remember when I was pushing these protected bike lanes, literally 7 miles from downtown, because I ride a bike every day. And I know that people ride bikes when they're safe and convenient and take you where you want to go, but not 7 miles from downtown. And so I was very visibly frustrated that the folks in the room, 99% African American, were really not getting it. And a sweet senior in the audience pulled me aside, and she said, "Maurice, we haven't all been to Paris." And so I just hope you will be patient with us, and then we'll get it. And I just said, wow, words of wisdom, pearls of wisdom from an elder. Because again, they saw it, they want to do these innovative things, but you need to pace it at a rate that they can receive it. And then, last year, by the way, Detroit laid more protected bike lanes than any city in America. So I rest my case.
So last question before we release everyone for dinner.
Okay, the last question. You said, Maurice, as you started speaking about how, in a way, the numbers of planners in the corporate world, in the philanthropic world, and city government was emblematic of the kind of disjunction between those groups. And then you said, but then they eventually came into alignment. And we so often see that disjunction, and it leads to a kind of dissolution and waste of resources. And I'm wondering, how did it come into alignment? I'd like to know.
Yeah. Well, I would like to hear Rip talk a little bit as well. I think, numbers matter. Diversity matters. It's really hard for consultants in our different professions, architecture, landscape architecture, planning, to work in Detroit because we require diversity, and most firms don't have it. And so, in effect, we do the planning, and we hire consultants as kind of to expand our bandwidth. So that's something that it's really, really disturbs me because I built one of the most diverse planning departments in the country in 48 months, and yet our disciplines can't seem to do this. So we'll work on that, right? But so I would say that there's really incredible alignment now. There are some outliers that we need to trade places, right? To shift their roles. I think the nonprofit community development groups are still struggling to accept a new role. But because before I had 40 planners, they were doing all the planning. Now they're not. And they are struggling to find their new role. They used to do all of the low-income housing. Now we graft affordable housing onto market rate housing. And so they no longer are being asked to do the low-income housing that they used to do. And so I think until that group gets in alignment, and they need resources, they need retraining, they need a renewed mission. I think that's going to be a key piece that will accelerate our process. But we have government is playing its role. We regulate, we implement, and we are now doing that. So the foundation community doesn't have to do that. The private sector can partner, and I think most importantly, the people of Detroit who were exercising their muscle is probably the strongest. But the resources perhaps did not follow their capacity. And so we are in the process of trying to find more and more resources to support that work. And that's, an unprecedented strategic fund for neighborhoods. That's an enormous fund that philanthropy, Kresge put in the first $15 million. We're almost complete in raising $130 million to realize the work you see on the slides. So I think some of this is just, this is a kind of moment. It's a moment in Detroit's history that it's pivoting, and people get it, and people want to be a part of it. And again, I don't know. There's an increasing alignment. I would be curious to hear.
So, Rip, would you like to give us the last set of remarks in response to this?
Well, I would just, I think, remind us all that there's been an enormous time compression here. I mean, Maurice has been here, 4 years? And to sort of recalibrate and realign these systems after this period of such enormous dislocation and dysfunction is going to take time. But I think the path is quite clear. I mean, the work that Maurice and his team, which is paralleled by the economic development team, which is paralleled by the housing team, I think the community is simply going to sort of follow in its wake. It doesn't mean that you don't build independent capacity on the part of community in all the ways we've suggested, but the fact that there are now community planning processes going on means that the community development system can sort of partner in a very different way than when it was partnering into a void. I mean, it's just different. And so I think the fact that you have someone, and all up and down his staff, you would see the same kind of quality. You have someone of Maurice's quality is going to sort of be the proof of the pudding. I mean, I think people will just realize that they're working in good faith, they're working competently, they're working in touch with community, and therefore we just need to kind of line up and all be a part of the same process rather than thinking that we've got to invent new systems, which was, I mean, I remember Mayor Duggan at one, the first time he was talking about Maurice at a public meeting with me, he said, it's so nice that we now have a city planning department that's not Rip Rapson. Well, I thought, yeah, right. I agree.
And Toni, I would just hopefully remind the audience that building the Just City, it's a long-term project.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So.
And there is a role for planning in it. So thank you, Maurice and Rip. This has been a delight to talk about this with you.